The federal government's fall fiscal update just a few weeks away, and how Ottawa plans to boost Canada's competitiveness is top of mind for many in the business community. Canada's former Finance Minister Joe Oliver has been thinking a lot about the issue. Joins us now. He's currently the chairman of Echelon Wealth Partners. Joe, always nice to see you.
Great to be here.
So we've heard a lot about this subject of competitiveness. From where you sit, how competitive is this country?
Well, not very, and it's unfortunately deteriorating. According to the World Economic Forum, which has a competitiveness index, we're 14th, well behind countries that we compete against. And it's actually different than our standard of living. It's a bit better, which indicates we're spending more on debt to bolster economic growth, which is unsustainable over the long term. And that's, of course, exactly what's happening, because we've got these deficits now at about 19 billion, and they're continuing with no end in sight. And some of the competitiveness indices are even worse. For example, on innovation, we're 24th. On government regulation, we're, I think, 43rd. So these are serious issues, and they're impacting on our trade deficit. They're creating a capital outflow. Last year, it was $70 billion. Canadian companies aren't as competitive as our American competitors, and workers are contributing 25% less to GDP than the Americans are, and not because they aren't skilled and work hard. It's because they don't have the competitive tools to deal with.
The tools, or even in our last segment, we're talking about wage growth of 3% year over year is seen as something that's pretty good versus inflation, but that doesn't put a lot more money in your pocket. So let's just talk a little bit more about the United States. Right. Us being next to the United States benefits our economy in a lot of ways.
It does.
But how much of this would you say is something that has become even more relevant in the era of Trump? I mean, we've got a new trade deal, so a check mark on that front. But people talk about the tax breaks. You mentioned regulation. Obviously, Trump has gone to a lot of rallies and talked about pushing away from some of the previous regulation. Has his White House changed the storyline of our competitiveness, would you say, over the last couple of years?
Absolutely. I mean, the most dramatic event, of course, was the big decline in corporate taxes. I mean, a dramatic decline, and the acceleration of capital cost allowance to 1 year from 10 years or 20 years, depending upon the particular investment. So companies that are looking to open new plants obviously are going to be attracted by that. I mean, that issue simply must be addressed, and I hope the Minister of Finance will do that. He's talking a bit about attacking it kind of piecemeal, and that, I think, would be a serious mistake. That's one of the issues. You alluded to regulation. He's had an attack on regulation, and regulation is not something you see directly, but it's all over. It affects competitiveness, it affects prices, and we're just not, we're buried in red tape, and that's a serious issue too.
So just to clarify, I mean, when it comes to the fall update, we ultimately don't know what it will be about, but most people have suggested it'll be some version of what we just talked about there, some kind of acknowledgement to businesses if you need to write off things a little faster that you can do that. There doesn't seem to be a lot of talk about tax cuts per se.
No, there isn't, and that's unfortunate. I mean, dealing with the accelerated depreciation issue is an urgent matter, and I hope they will, in fact, do that, and I'll applaud it if they do. But I think they've got to deal with overall tax rates as well. Companies that aren't making capital investments, are being disadvantaged on a continuing basis. And then, of course, the other thing that you didn't mention that Trump is doing is accelerating resource development. The United States this year has become the largest producer of oil and gas in the entire world. I mean, that has all sorts of positive economic and security implications for the United States. In the meantime, the discount that we're selling our oil to the Americans which was costing us $15 billion every single year, is now, on the current prices, shot up to about $43 billion. And governments are going to lose almost $20 billion every year. This is a national disgrace.
Well, we might be able to show viewers again, I mean, we talk a lot about it in our energy segments, the difference right now between WTI crude prices, you know, 67 buck range and roughly 21 bucks for Canadian prices, which gets you to this discount we're showing right now of around 45 bucks. On the subject of taxes, obviously a lot of talk this week about carbon taxes sort of re-messaged as the price on pollution by the federal government. They've got a plan. They are sticking to it. I think I already know what your opinion on this matter is going to be.
Yes. Well, I have a real concern about the carbon tax, but well, first of all, I don't think it's effective, and in fact, at $50, the United Nations said it may have to go up to $5,500 a ton. So, the first point is it may not work in terms of changing consumer behavior, but what the Prime Minister is proposing is to give back some, or he claims all, of the tax, which is going to affect everything, back to individuals, but he's not giving any of it back to corporations. So that exacerbates the competitiveness issue.
Just before you go, how do you feel about stocks and politics coming together? Let me use the U.S. example. You've got Larry Kudlow, who obviously is one of the president's people focused on issues surrounding business, who this week basically said stocks were falling because of the fear that Democrats are going to win the midterm elections. And a lot of people, a lot of market players, not Democrats or Republicans, kind of jumped on him for saying that. And yet, if we continue to see weakness in the Canadian stock market, inevitably, we've got a federal election coming around the corner. I would imagine that politics and the stock market are going to find their way to do some kind of dance. How do you feel about that?
Well, try to depoliticize it a bit. The issue is, what will the policies do to the economy? And if we don't address the competitiveness issues, then we're in trouble. And the Bank of Canada recognized that too, and they're totally nonpartisan. We've got an issue, and we simply have to deal with it. The concern in the United States is whether a Democratic Congress will be disruptive and may move to policies which aren't as business friendly. So that's the issue there. In Canada, there's a slightly different dynamic, but it's not entirely different.
All right, Joe, always good to get your take. Thanks a lot.
Glad to be here.